Well, welcome everyone. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land on which we're meeting this evening, Yagara and Turrbal peoples. I'd like to pay my respects to their elders, past, present and emerging, and I'd like to extend that respect to all Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander people. As some of you probably know, my name's Ian Hall. I'm the Acting Director of the Griffith Asia Institute, and it's my pleasure to be back here at the Queensland Art Gallery, Gallery of Modern Art, our partners in this fantastic venture, Perspectives Asia, which aims to bring to you perspectives from around the region and from in Australia as to all the dynamic changes that are happening politically, culturally, economically, socially across this wonderful region of ours. This evening, to kick us off for 2023, I'm really very pleased to introduce Peter Lee. So Peter is, I hope he won't be embarrassed by this, one of the finest young minds, younger than me at least, minds, working on all the regional dynamics, the changing geopolitical security dynamics of our great big region. He's got degrees from Melbourne University and a PhD from the Australian National University, where he worked on Australia-Korea relations, a relationship that is, I think, has been neglected in scholarship, but it's also a relationship that has not really had the attention that it deserves from both governments either in the last few years. He is currently a research fellow with the Foreign Policy and Defence Program at the United States Studies Centre at the University of Sydney, and at the same time he's also a Career Foundation research fellow at Melbourne as well. His work has appeared in multiple academic outlets. He also writes regularly for the media, and of course he produces policy reports and briefs and does lots of events and public things like that for the US Studies Centre down in Sydney. Today's talk is, I think you'll all agree, very timely. Last week we had a major dialogue in Delhi where the foreign ministers of the Quad countries, Australia, Japan, India and the United States all met together in what was a very friendly discussion that I was privileged enough to be in the audience for. And of course today, right now, Anthony Albanese is with the Indian Prime Minister in India. And what we're seeing is extraordinarily active, proactive behaviour from a whole range of countries across the region trying to adapt and position themselves for the world that is to come and the region that is to come over the next couple of decades or so. So I'd like to introduce then Peter, who's going to be talking about perhaps how to negotiate some of these dynamics, some of these changes that we're going to see, and he's going to speak specifically on how to survive the new Cold War as a middle power. Peter, welcome.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you so much for coming today, and thank you to Ian for that overly generous introduction. I too would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional custodians of the land upon which we are gathered here tonight, the Yagara and Turrbal people. I'm very fortunate to be able to work in Sydney and Melbourne on the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, as well as the lands of the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation in Melbourne. I'd like to pay my respects to the elders past, present and emerging, and extend that respect to any Aboriginal or Torres Strait Islander people here today. Given the focus of my remarks tonight on how we as a country are to stay safe and sovereign and secure in a competitive world, I acknowledge that these lands were never ceded and that sovereignty here was never ceded, and the struggle to defend Australia has been ongoing for tens of thousands of years. I want to thank Ian and Tarun and all the team for inviting me to give this lecture tonight. I didn't know I was the first one off the rank for 2023. I hope I don't disappoint. It's my first time doing a lecture in an art gallery, so I was expecting a dingy seminar room somewhere on campus to do this, so it's a bit of a nice change. So I'll spend the next 20 to 25 minutes tonight just telling you a little bit about the Korean experience. And so, surviving the new Cold War as a middle power, the subtitle would be How South Korea Survived the Last One and How Australia Can Survive the Next One. I hope to do three things tonight in my very short presentation. First, I want to explain why we actually have greater cause for hope in this new Cold War than the last one. Second, I want to share a little bit about the South Korean experience of dealing with great powers. There are many dilemmas and trade-offs that middle powers face. And I'll touch on 3 of them tonight: the fear of abandonment, the choice between great powers, and protecting our national sovereignty. Third, I'll highlight what Australia can learn from the Korean experience and offer 6 tips for how we can survive and potentially thrive in this new era of great power competition. So at first I was afraid, I was petrified. If you turn on the news these days, it feels like the world is coming apart and we are falling headlong into a Cold War. Watching the ongoing war in Ukraine, watching economic and technology decoupling, watching the new competition for influence in our region, watching a new space race unfold and artificial islands being built in the sea, watching the US reaction to the Chinese surveillance balloon, and hoping that great powers will do something about global crises like climate change or nuclear disarmament. All of these events are reminiscent of the last Cold War. This new Cold War is similarly being defined by competition between 2 increasingly distinct blocks of countries struggling over their visions of ideology, institutions, influence, supply chains, and emerging technologies. But then I spent so many nights thinking how you did me wrong, and I grew strong. A key difference from the last Cold War is that Australia now finds itself in the company of many more countries like it, middle powers, and these countries are more powerful than they ever were. During the last Cold War, it used to just be the G7 countries. Now we talk of the G20, countries from India and Indonesia to Turkey, Mexico, and South Africa, countries that we would not consider the great powers of our international system. It's now the good, the bad, and the ugly. They all possess great value to great powers, these countries, from geography to critical minerals, energy and industrial capacity, new technologies, and culture. The international system today is increasingly multipolar, not bipolar, let alone the unipolar moment. So we used to look up. I think now we look around at different players of different sizes and trying to figure out how we navigate this more interconnected and popular system. And so when we have meetings like the G20, I think the voice for countries like Australia is much greater than it once was. From the ashes of war, the miracle on the Han River, Korea has been dealing with these challenges of navigating great power competition for a long, long time. 70 years ago marked the catastrophic culmination of failing to navigate great power competition. 70 years ago, the Korean Peninsula was completely devastated in the war. General Douglas MacArthur, who was in charge of UN forces during the war, once said, "This country has no future. This country will not be restored even after 100 years." But, ladies and gentlemen, Korea was restored. The miracle on the Han River, as it came to be known, unfolded in the span of one lifetime, less than General MacArthur's 100 years. Today, Korea is one of the world's most prosperous and developed countries and a leading art house and economic powerhouse. So what can we learn from countries like South Korea, who are dealing with similar challenges from the United States and China? Today, South Korea is a thriving and prosperous liberal democracy in a region of authoritarian giants. Today, Korean products are global leaders, ranging from phones and electronics to cars and ships. I'm sure most of you have at least one Korean product in your home somewhere. Such is the popularity of all things Korean these days that we now see the letter K in front of just about everything, from K-pop to K-drama to K-beauty to Korean fried chicken. Yet at the same time, Korea never left the last Cold War. Korea still has national conscription. Korea still has a national security law where communism is effectively banned. There are military checkpoints and bases throughout the country, and national mobilization plans and emergency drills are a daily part of life. So in short, how did Korea survive and thrive in that Cold War? And what does that tell us about how we in Australia can survive what is coming in the years to come? ladies and gentlemen, it was not smooth sailing. In fact, Korea's journey has been one of constantly navigating troubled seas and making difficult choices. It's, I think, best encapsulated by the Korean proverb that when whales fight, the shrimp's back is broken. So tonight, I thought I'd just focus on 3 of these dilemmas to illustrate the core tensions that Korean leaders and rulers have sought to overcome, not just in the last 70 years, but for centuries and millennia. The first dilemma is that by forging an alliance with countries such as the United States, a middle power like Korea faces the fear of abandonment, or worse, the fear of entrapment in an unwanted conflict. In case you forgot, a few years ago, we had a bit of a crisis on the Korean Peninsula, where people were a bit worried about nuclear war. At the time, South Korea was dealing with a US president who wanted to extort South Korea while secretly wanting to withdraw the US forces based there. At the same time, he was threatening to start a preemptive war with North Korea over fire and fury. Korea was truly caught between a rock and a hard place. For Australia, the fear of abandonment has also long been a defining feature of our foreign and defence policy. More recently, the fear of entrapment in a conflict over Taiwan or elsewhere continues to be fiercely debated in Canberra and elsewhere. A fundamental axiom of studying middle powers is that the international system is not equal and that it is hierarchical. And this goes against the logic of the United Nations, where all states are sovereign and equal at the same level. To be a middle power is to say that some countries are different, with greater responsibilities and power. This photo is a scene from the 2017 Korean film, The Fortress. And it depicts the Korean kingdom, then known as Joseon, its fatal choice between the declining Ming dynasty of China and the rising Manchu that would go on to become the Qing dynasty. Just as Europe was signing the Peace of Westphalia in 1648, enshrining sovereign equality amongst all states, in East Asia, a hierarchical order transition was underway. Throughout the early 17th century, the Manchu had conquered much of China, overthrowing the Ming dynasty after almost 300 years. In this transition, Joseon chose the Ming, because the Ming had fought 2 devastating wars to protect Joseon from Japanese invasion. Completely exhausted by that struggle, the Ming were overthrown by the Manchu. In January 1637, the Joseon King Injo knelt 3 times and bowed 9 times before Hongtaji, the Manchu ruler. That was not the only part of the outcome. About 500,000 Koreans were taken as slaves to the Manchu capital, about 10% of the population at the time. There are echoes of today's debates over where we stand in the US-China competition and what middle power should do, and the devastating consequences of choosing wrong. Finally, what does it mean to be a sovereign middle power in an era of great power competition? For many Korean progressives, US bases and US soldiers and US wartime operational control over the South Korean military are all reminders of how South Korea is still not a normal country. Here is a photo of US soldiers that help patrol the demilitarized zone known as Panmunjom, where North and South Korean soldiers engage with each other. This idea that Korea is an abnormal country has a great purchase throughout much of Northeast Asia, though. The Japanese right rails against Article 9 and the fact that Japan is barred from the use of armed force. The Japanese left rails against the US military presence in Japan. Chinese nationalists talk about unification with Taiwan as fulfilling China's renormalization. Taiwanese nationalists talk about independence and becoming an internationally recognized normal country. Yet in many respects, I think the only normal country in Northeast Asia is North Korea. the only one that would fit the sovereign definition of no foreign forces, totally self-sufficient, and nuclear weapons to guarantee its own security. There is no silver bullet to overcoming any of these dilemmas, but we need a new way of thinking and living under pressure. So I'd like to explore 6 tips from the Korean experience that can help Australia guide its way through this new era of competition. The lesson of Korean history is that without clear principles and guiding lights about precisely what it is that we seek to achieve vis-a-vis Washington or Beijing, that we ultimately invite misunderstanding and miscalculation. So what are the core values and interests that are not negotiable? How far will we sacrifice to defend those? To ask the Joseon king, when do we need to bet the house and when do we have to fold? Ideally, we make that choice before the crisis is upon us. Second, we need to be the collective voices of reason to stop uncontrolled spirals of escalation and hysteria between the great powers themselves. Today, the US talks about guardrails in its competition with China. I think we need to be the guardrails. We must remind both the United States and China to play by the rules, because the rules are what keep middle powers secure, whether that's in institutions like the UN or WTO, or in regional fora, where everybody gets a voice. We have to shape a regional order where both the US and China can coexist with roles that each is willing to live with, if not entirely satisfied by. At the same time, we should also be careful of great power arrangements that sacrifice the interests of middle powers and smaller countries. Much like the 1938 Munich Agreement between Nazi Germany and the Western powers that sacrificed Czechoslovakia, the middle power of Europe at the time. In Southeast Asia, they have a metaphor for this, often attributed to Singapore's founding father, Lee Kuan Yew. When elephants fight, the grass suffers. But when elephants make love, the grass also suffers. Third, we need to find solidarity with each other. And so, as Ian was mentioning, my PhD thesis was on the Australia-Korea relationship and how that has not lived up to its potential. I think it will, eventually. I think we're starting to come to terms with how we work with each other rather than just looking to the great powers for our security. During the last Cold War, middle power solidarity didn't really exist. There weren't very many middle powers to have solidarity with. Today, middle powers can help each other in times of crisis, and I think they're starting to learn how. So to offer just one example of how this looks in practice, let me share the AdBlue crisis. I don't know if anyone here drives a diesel car. Does anybody? Okay, so only like 2 people are going to know this story. So Korea used to produce something called urea, which is a chemical additive to reduce diesel exhaust emissions that's used in cars, trucks, and buses, as well as agricultural fertilizer. But all the Korean factories that used to make this shut down about 10 to 15 years ago because of cheaper Chinese factories that were basically undercutting this on the global market. So, come a few years ago, Korea found itself 97% dependent on Chinese imports of urea. In 2021, during the pandemic, China halted all exports of AdBlue, the chemical product of urea, due to a domestic shortage within China. This led to a nationwide crisis in Korea as millions of cars and trucks and buses and taxis ground to a halt. People had long lines at petrol stations waiting to add this additive. In this time of need, Australia provided 27,000 litres of urea from our reserves. They were collected on South Korean military cargo tankers that flew in and flew out from Sydney and other cities. Now, 27,000 litres sounds like a lot. It's only a tiny fraction of the 600,000 litres that Korea uses every day. But it was an important and I think symbolic gesture of solidarity with a country in its time of crisis. More importantly, for me at least, It has spurred a whole new discussion between Australia and Korea about how we rethink cooperation, how now Korean firms are investing in joint ventures in places like South Australia to build Australia's urea manufacturing capacity. The lesson of the AdBlue crisis is that middle powers must have resilient supply chains based on trusted partnerships. I think the days of cheap and easy are gone. The basis of all three dilemmas that I've discussed tonight is national power. That is ultimately what makes a middle power a middle power. I think middle powers need to become a bit more powerful. Korea's rise was made possible through manufacturing of the miracle on the Han River. Today, and this is my first time in Brisbane, so please forgive me, we need the miracle on the Maiwar River. We need the miracle on the Parramatta River, on the Yarra River, on the Swan River, on the River Torrens, and all through our regional and rural cities. Sovereign manufacturing will be a key part of national power as we seize the clean energy transition, where Korea and Australia are already doing exciting work, especially here in Queensland, in places like Townsville on green hydrogen and so forth. Fifth, we need to think more creatively about what sovereignty is. We need to move beyond a narrow view of sovereignty as somehow synonymous with self-sufficiency, that we have to do everything here. During the Korean War, South Korea traded its sovereignty for security by placing its forces under the command of General Douglas MacArthur. So did Australia during the Second World War in 1942, when we placed that same General Douglas MacArthur in charge of all Australian forces. So we must ask ourselves, what can we do ourselves? What should we do ourselves? What do we need help for? What makes sense to work collectively with other countries? At the same time, what are our red lines for sovereign control? My day job is working on the Australia-US alliance, and so half of my time is spent thinking about nuclear submarines these days. And this is the question that I wake up every night or every morning thinking about. How do we retain sovereignty as we pursue a deeper relationship with the United States that ultimately we hope will enhance our security? We need to think creatively about sovereignty in ways that leverage the power and partnerships and alliances that we have. So, for instance, Australia has a long-standing bipartisan policy that there are no foreign bases on Australian soil and that there never will be. Yet every year, thousands of American soldiers visit and train here. Thousands of Singaporean soldiers come to Queensland every year, and they've been doing so for a long time. They're developing infrastructure, I think, to do that for the next 25 years. So thinking about how sovereignty can be best understood in a world where we are deepening these partnerships and relationships, including, I would hope, with Japan and Korea in the years to come. And it's going to be very crucial. Finally, survival tip number 6, go global, not local. Some of you might have heard the term the Hermit Kingdom. It's what the kingdom of Choson was once called. So after the power transition that unfolded in China in the early 17th century, for the dark centuries of the Qing Imperium that Korea did not recognize as a barbarian Manchu overlord, Korea's rulers retreated behind their walls and shunned the outside world. They tried to be self-sufficient. It did not last. Korea would soon become the battleground of Northeast Asia and ultimately seized and occupied as a Japanese colony. Today, North Korea carries on the mantle of the Hermit Kingdom. So we must go forth with courage and a sense of adventure to secure our interests in a competitive world. That is the miracle on the Han River. That is how South Korea survived the Cold War. In the immortal words of Gloria Gaynor in a hit 1978 song, "You'd think I'd crumble, you'd think I'd lay down and die. Oh no, not I will survive." Ladies and gentlemen, we will survive. I have great hope. Korea has a long history of navigating great power competition. It sometimes succeeded and it sometimes failed. But time is the ultimate teacher. South Korea learnt the lessons, and so can Australia. We're entering a difficult era of strategic competition that will test the very fabric of our society. The 3 dilemmas I discussed tonight of abandonment, of power transition, and of sovereignty can be managed, but not entirely resolved. But I think there will be opportunities for middle powers like Australia to strive for greatness if we seize them. Thank you very much.
So, look, thank you so much, Peter. I'm not supposed to thank you, though. I'm supposed to ask Taryn to come up and offer a vote of thanks, and also to manage some questions and so on, if that's okay. Or do you like me to do questions? I can do questions. All right. So I'll do some questions. And so we've got questions, comments, and so on. When you're asking a question, please can you identify yourself? Just give us your name, and if you have an affiliation and you want to declare it, then please do so. And yes, so I'm open to questions and comments and so on. Yes, sir.
I'm Graham Kirich. I'm from the AIIA. Look, thank you for that presentation. I'm interested in your views as to whether Australia is ready to make the progression since the last few years, where we've been so much focused on the US and British relationships. To some extent with India, although I'm really not too sure as to how maturely we are engaging with India, but to make the progression to a middle power relationship with countries like South Korea, Singapore, Indonesia, in particular, which are real partners or potential partners in our region.
Should I take that?
Yep, sure.
I'll let Ian take the India part of that question. No, it's a really important one. I think I'd say they're not mutually exclusive. And I think all middle powers, at least the US treaty allies, so Korea, Japan, and the Philippines, and Australia, I think strengthening ties with your great power ally comes hand in hand with trying to do more with other countries. And I guess sort of the third part of that tripod would be self-strengthening, building the capacity, the resilience, the national power at home. So I think countries have to do all three things, right? You have to become a much more capable country at home. You have to deepen your alliance with the United States during this time of insecurity. And you have to forge that sort of relationship with a broader cluster of countries, because it gives you more leverage when you then have to deal with the United States or with China or with any other great power, I think. In terms of whether we're ready for that transition, that progression, I think it's a really important question. If you look back at the history of our foreign policy white papers, the aspiration has been there for decades to do more with Asia, whether that's investing in languages to train the next generation of diplomats. Those generation of diplomats have all come and gone, and we still don't have those toolkits ready, I think. And whether that's understanding our region, which it's sometimes a bit of a lonely struggle, I guess, here in Australia to understand Asia. I think that's where venues like this are so important. But ultimately, I think it's a very select group of people that need to be educated on that. And they sit in Canberra, in certain buildings, ultimately deciding how we deal with these countries. So whether a country and a people are ready for that, I would say, I was talking to a few people before we started that Korean culture is a huge thing here in Brisbane right now. I wasn't expecting that, just because like everywhere else, usually there is a large Asian diaspora and they sort of channel that interest. So I think the society is ready. It's whether policymakers in Canberra and in a few other places can sort of build on that. And that requires, I think, being able to balance the relationship with the United States, with the UK, with other equally important ones. And I think at least this government is trying to do that with the PM in India right now, for instance. But at the same time, I think so much of the bandwidth of the country right now here in Australia is very much focused on the United States, and at least getting that right. So priorities and trade-offs.
Thanks, Peter. I think I've got a question from David, and I've got one at the back as well. So David first.
In the last several months, the China threat has been escalated in the Channel 9's newspapers a couple of days ago. How is that inhibiting or whatever Australia's growth as a middle power, in a sense, with its own thrust in what it sees itself as and where it thinks itself is going?
It's a very important question. I think especially as an Australian of Asian descent, it's one that I grapple with every day when I see stories like this, whether it's red alert or red alarm or yellow peril. It's not going to go away. I think the more problematic and challenging our relationship with the People's Republic of China becomes. And that's by Chinese actions, but by China's growing power. We are in for a very difficult period. So we're going to have to learn probably the best lesson of the Cold War, right? How do you avoid, fear-mongering, the xenophobia, and so forth that came during that conflict over many decades? I think it's going to be a very difficult and long-term struggle. And watching at least the United States debate and how that has tracked in the last few years does not give me great cause for hope some days. I think Australia can do better than that. I think having a foreign minister of Asian descent is probably at least one plus sign on some of those more alarmist rhetoric that we are seeing. But I think to hope that everybody's going to be rational about differentiating between the People's Republic of China and the Chinese diaspora in Australia is very, very difficult. And it's going to become harder because there are going to be more Australians of Asian descent in this country in the decades to come. So learning how to manage that tension is not going to be easy. And I say that as someone who, when I'm not thinking about nuclear submarines, I just sit around wondering, what is my place in this country? How are we going to deal with this? And I'm not even of Chinese descent. I'm of Korean descent. So it's, I could say, well, I'm not Chinese, so I'm out of that one. Well, not really, right? Most people probably can't tell the difference. So it's figuring out, that broader national narrative and the social consensus that we're going to need to defend our interests where necessary without, falling into, hysteria and hyperbole. It's going to be a very difficult one, though.
Okay, I've got hands popping up left, right, and centre. So Diego at the back, and then I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So I'm going to try and remember those. Diego.
Thank you for the presentation. Very interesting. Diego Leiva from Griffith University. I want to ask you about South Korea's role in this new Cold War. It's fascinating. And I'm interested in the technological aspect of the Cold War. South Korea has been always, many years, a very important actor in technology. What's the role of South Korea, actually, currently and in the future, in terms of technology, 5G development? Seems to be a very important dimension of this new.
Yeah. Two companies will be pivotal in the coming era of competition: Samsung Electronics and SK Hynix. SK Hynix doesn't have a bigger presence here, but it's basically like if Telstra, Optus, and a whole bunch of other telcos were one company. No, I think Korea's technology industrial base will be the engine for the collective defense of all of these countries, not just Korea itself. It's going to be the engine to sustain US leadership of the collective effort that other countries are trying to, grapple with right now in terms of how do we sustain a healthy competition and balance with China on many of these emerging areas. That is essentially the aspiration behind Orcas Pillar 2, that we need to leverage key defense and advanced manufacturing capabilities in this country that we can't do it by ourselves. So we're going to need the US help. We're going to have to work with Japan, Korea, New Zealand, Canada, and others over many decades. I think it's quite interesting in a lot of the work that I do at the US Studies Center, for instance, where a lot of the debate about how do we actually respond to China boils down to sort of the United States, Australia, Japan, and then sometimes the Europeans. And that sort of is the extent of that debate sometimes. I think just because countries are not perfectly aligned rhetorically or strategically with where the US setting is right now does not diminish the important value that they have. And I think people are waking up to realize that, hey, India is going to be very important. The Philippines is going to be very important. South Korea will be important. Just because of this government at one particular point in time might not be singing the same tune, I think is a bit of a short-sighted view. And I think some of that debate about Korea took that view, that a certain government in Korea was perhaps too focused on North Korea, or was not as anti-China as some other countries would have wanted, and so Korea was no longer important. I think this new government has reminded people that, well, there are other drivers within the Korean system beyond who's in charge. And I think semiconductors will be a key area where we're going to basically have to figure out how we work with Korea to sustain that advantage. Yeah.
Wonderful, thank you. So, sir in the blue shirt, and then I'll come to you. Yes.
Thank you. Thank you very much for a very succinct and enlightening address. Yes, most of Australians are asking, how do we respond to China? My question is, how do we respond to the United States? I've just read Kevin Rudd's book last year on avoiding war, and I also read Graham Allison's book on the Peace Trap. And I just wonder whether, as a middle power, how do we assist in a rising power and a ruling power, which are the major issues involved here, which you have not mentioned, which I think is really quite critical to what's happening.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think, if I can go back, all of these apply equally to the United States. These are not just strategies and tools to deal with China and Chinese economic coercion or China's growing presence in the region. I think a lot of the work that I do on the Australia-US relationship, for instance, is actually trying to figure out where are the points of difference in our relations with the United States? How do we overcome them in a productive and constructive way, given we are allies? There's actually a lot to learn about how the Koreans and Japanese have done that, because they've had 70 years of much higher stakes in managing that alliance relationship. So just to give you one example, because Korea and Japan do have US bases, and they have about 56,000 in Japan and about 28,500 in Korea. Add on to that contractors, families, dependents, and so forth, you have tens of thousands of people. So one of the most interesting things to watch about Korea-US relations is something called cost sharing. Basically, who pays for the upkeep and maintenance of these bases, the cleaning, the gardening, everything. These are very intense debates that have multiple rounds of negotiators going back and forth throughout the year, hammering out the nuts and bolts. You're paying for this, I'm not paying for that, I don't want to pay any more, you should pay more. We've never really had to do that in Australia, right? Because we often traded on goodwill, we never really had that American burden of a military presence here. Our former prime ministers had negotiated a much better deal where we had joint facilities. We had no areas where Australians were not allowed to go in because they were somehow US jurisdiction. So learning from how Korea and Japan have done that, how they've managed to secure their interests, not always fall just because the United States requests it. Cost sharing is just one example of the wider aperture of many things where allies don't agree. But allies can disagree all the time. I think today, for instance, one example would be trade. Australia, despite all of our troubles with China right now, we still signed up to the Regional Comprehensive Economic Partnership, known as RCEP. We are still part of the AIIB, the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, set up by China. So on many of these questions, Australia has not said, okay, we completely decouple from China, we're going to do everything that the US wants, just because that's what they're doing. We retain those policies because we see them as in our national interest. So often those debates with the United States become, well, we want to continue doing this thing, even though it might not be what the US wants. And I think being able to artfully and deftly negotiate that, often behind closed doors, obviously, is a testament of what a healthy alliance can look like. And so most recently, when the United States announced a number of acts in Congress and from the White House, they were basically seeking to reshore production and manufacturing of key technologies, semiconductors, a lot of things back to the United States. This is, obviously a bipartisan trend in the US. Korea sent a whole delegation of negotiators to Washington to say why this was a bad deal, why it was going to put Korean firms at a disadvantage. because it was going to basically add tariffs to them. So that is how we can learn to negotiate and defend our interests with the United States. But I think, more importantly, the challenges will be how do we do that productively, constructively with China? Because that's something that we really haven't learned how to do for the last decade or so, especially in the last few years, I think.
Thanks, Peter. I think it's a very helpful reminder of how thin the relationship actually is with the United States. And speaking as somebody who came from the UK originally, that's, again, we've got bases, we've quite a complex relationship, requires a lot of negotiation. Sorry. Yes, madam.
Helen Whitlock, I wanted to ask, when you're talking about middle powers, do you believe that collectively middle power nations can become superpowers? And if we can have that alignment, we have considerable power to influence against what we consider singular superpowers.
That is the European Union. I think in many ways. Yes. I was in Brussels a few weeks ago, and it's fascinating to understand how they think about their relations with each other. Whether it's a separate entry point at the airport when you go in, and all the EU nationals go into this one. There are so many interesting sort of signs of how much they've pulled their sovereignty and really sort of relinquished these very sort of nationalist sentiments. Ultimately, though, we would look at the war in Ukraine and say the European Union was insufficient to protect Europe's interests. That ultimately became the United States that has shouldered the burden of that conflict. But the aspiration is there, and I think many countries and regions have tried that. ASEAN is one sort of example of how countries in Southeast Asia are trying to think about new ways to build their collective resilience against both the US and China in that regard. Even in the Gulf, so the Gulf Cooperation Council, it's really a way to bring back, I guess, or to overcome what they see as the traumas of colonial partition in their region, the countries that are fundamentally culturally very similar, like Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Oman, and others, to tap into what they see as their greatest asset, which is energy, and to work collectively together rather than basically compete with each other and undercut each other. So I think there are many precedents of where middle powers have tried to pool their resources to form a third bloc, and probably the most famous would be the non-aligned movement during the Cold War. So the last Cold War, a whole bunch of countries led by India, Indonesia, and a few others basically said, well, we don't want a part of any of this. We're just going to go do our own thing. I'd say that the new Cold War makes that harder in many ways because we're so interconnected. And so right now we are going through this period where those linkages and sort of bonds are being torn and being rethought in many ways. And to set up your own third island away from all of this will be quite difficult. So I think it's how do you navigate between the two rather than saying we opt out. So I don't think anyone in Canberra or Seoul thinks of it as to reject the alliance with America, to reject ties with China, and to seek total autarky through separate relations. I think it's going to be a very challenging one.
Thank you. So I'm going to go with Claudia, and then gentleman at the back, and then gentleman up there. So Claudia.
Thank you for your speech, setting out the scene of the chilled Cold War, and sharing with us about the dilemma the Korea faced, such as navigating the sovereignty, with that very symbolic photo of the towering, tall American soldier as opposed to the Korean soldier.
That's the tallest Koreans that they can find, by the way.
Now, right in front of us, we expected you to say tips to survive this new Cold War. That is manageable. But I think this is more a wish list, and the detail is in the how that is not there. For example, middle power solidarity just between Korea and Japan, and I like to see the solidarity there. But I'm more related to Korea. If you have to navigate your sovereignty, I'd like to hear your view about how do you think creatively about sovereignty.
Yeah, thank you for the great feedback. I think, to give you the example of middle power solidarity, the current government, for instance, is in South Korea, is pushing very, very hard on reconciliation with Japan, because they recognize that it's been a long-standing sore in not only Korea-Japan relations, but what they think needs to happen amongst US allies more broadly. That it very much is the weakest link, and that the only countries in the region that enjoy Korea-Japan relations being bad are probably China and Russia and North Korea. It doesn't mean that there is sort of a secret playbook, though. Korea has tried many different configurations of middle power solidarity, just to take that as an example. So some Korean leaders, the last Korean government, invested very, very heavily in Southeast Asia. And they saw that as a way out from this, what they called sort of the great power four, right? Japan, China, Russia, North Korea, and the US, that sort of environment. They saw Southeast Asia as a way that, if you look at it as a collective, Korea does more trade in Southeast Asia after China than any other country. Now, it's not a country, but it's an important market, an important partner for Korea. The government before that placed huge weight on Central Asia for energy security, for a lot of other issues, for infrastructure investment and so forth. So the Korean president before them traveled all through Southeast Asia. A Eurasia initiative was their aspiration to sort of break free from this reliance. Australia, I think, depending on which government is in power, we have our own sort of orientations around that, right? And I think at least a Labour tradition in Australia has been Southeast Asia and the Pacific as important pathways that we sort of strengthen our hand when it comes to dealing with major powers. In terms of the question of navigating sovereignty and what that should be going forward, the question, I guess, for the Korean left would be, why do you have to be so insistent on reclaiming normality? So the current debate in Korea is around a question of wartime operational control. It's a very complicated word. It's actually very simple. It means if there is a war on the Korean Peninsula, that the American general on the Combined Forces Command takes charge of all the South Korean soldiers. In peacetime, Korea has control of its own forces, but in a war, the American general will take charge. The Korean left has been fighting a multi-decade struggle to reclaim that, because they say, in a war, surely we would control our own soldiers. At the same time, we look at Australia, and the way that we are tracking in our relationship with the United States, we are moving far more towards combined and integrated operability. So for many, many years, there have been Australian military personnel serving in the United States, hundreds of them. They serve in the Pentagon, they serve in Indo-PACOM, in Hawaii. There are American military personnel that train here and work here with us. There are Australian sailors on US nuclear submarines, and they've been there long before the Orcas agreement. So that level of integration and interoperability would strike perhaps many people in Australia, or at least some, as fundamentally against our national sovereignty. That why would we be enmeshed in another country's military command? The trajectory that we're heading towards is to think more differently about sovereignty, that somehow it's not this black and white picture. And I think AUKUS, we can talk about AUKUS if we want, is sort of the culmination of that question. How do we rethink our sovereignty in a creative way that gets us access to things that in many ways, if you look at it from the US perspective, would be a deep abrogation of their national sovereignty. To relinquish nuclear technology that they've never given to anyone, and they're going to give it to Australia. So that in itself would be the flip side for the US to consider, I think, that they're making a very, very big bet in terms of sharing their sovereignty on something like that.
Okay, so gentleman at the back, and then I'm going to come to you, sir. And those will be the last two questions. So.
Thank you, Captain, for your speech. And just one small question, that is, as you have just mentioned, there is actually thinner time between the Australia and the US than the time between Korea and the US. But actually, the Australians seem to getting more and more involved with US and UK, like the Orcas, and they're supposed to be buying some nuclear submarines from the US recently. And so, just reason rather than just to hype up the hysteria, but how to just balance the signal delivered and their, from the action from the Australia and their policies. The fear of being abandoned by the US.
No, it's a very important question. And as someone who studies Korean history and the Korean model, one of the things that always frustrates me about having grown up in Australia is that we lost sovereign manufacturing on so many things. So when I was growing up, they used to build cars down in Melbourne and in Adelaide. We don't build cars anymore. So the defense industrial base of this country, over many, many years, over many decades, is nowhere near what Korea's is. And that's largely a byproduct of living through a Cold War, of needing to sustain a large military industrial base. What does that look like in 2023? Korea is now one of the world's largest arms exporters. Korean military equipment is now filling the inventories of much of Eastern Europe, in Southeast Asia, in the Middle East, places where the US industrial base is no longer even able to handle. Australia is the world's 4th largest arms importer. That is basically, we don't make anything, or I should clarify, we don't make many of the things that we need to defend this country. So the question of AUKUS really comes down to, if we had been a major shipbuilder in this country, if we had produced submarines for export to our partners such as Indonesia and the Philippines, perhaps we wouldn't have needed AUKUS. Perhaps we would have said, well, we'll do it ourselves if we decided we needed nuclear technology or nuclear-powered submarines. So AUKUS, in my view, is really one test of what an already very robust alliance relationship that looks very different to those in Northeast Asia, so without the bases, without joint command, but it has fundamentally higher levels of trust in many ways. So to just put one more example on top of that, there's something called the Five Eyes Intelligence Sharing Agreement. It dates back to the Second World War. Basically, the United States shares some of its most intimate intelligence with Australia and New Zealand and Canada and the UK. And it comes out of their shared endeavors through the Cold War. That is something that Korea and Japan actually don't receive because of a whole range of issues that, in the 6 minutes we have, we can't get into. But so the level of trust by the US in Australia, I think, is one of those things that made AUKUS possible. AUKUS is unlikely to ever happen with Korea or Japan for a whole range of reasons in terms of nuclear sharing. So the idea that Australia can navigate its way through the world while actually deepening its defense industrial cooperation with the United States, I don't think they're actually contradictory. I think if you look at where Australia's industrial and defense base is today, AUKUS is something that's going to be a game changer. It's something that we will never be able to do ourselves for the next 20, 30, 50 years. But I think it's also a response to how quickly the strategic environment vis-a-vis China has changed in the last decade or so. By that I mean, the rise of China is what has given impulse and given logic and reason to this pursuit of nuclear-powered submarines. It's the Chinese naval buildup that is generating the desire in Australia and many other countries in the region to secure themselves from what appears to be a very rapidly increasing threat. So if there was no military buildup in China, there would probably be no need for AUKUS. Korea and Japan and others would probably not be doubling their defense budgets very rapidly. So it's not, I don't think we can look at it in isolation. I think it's one more peg in a very much longer series of pegs that many in the region are starting to put together in terms of how they respond to that challenge.
Brilliant. One last question, please. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I really enjoyed the speech. I particularly liked how musical lyrics were woven in
Yes.
as well. It was quite enjoyable. And I think for me, of these tips, the middle power solidarity is the one that really speaks to me the most. And so on that solidarity, why was South Korea so slow to provide aid to Ukraine and other middle powers? And in particular military aid, especially when you talked about how South Korea is ascended in their military industry. We're going to import stuff from them, as you mentioned, so is Poland. So South Korea seems to be quite happy to sell that to Poland, and yet when we look at what's happened in Ukraine, sure, the US has definitely backstopped Ukraine and really supported them, but it's all of those Eastern European countries which has proportionately provided the most support to Ukraine. And so on that solidarity question, is solidarity only regional?
Yeah, no, it's a fantastic, and I'll make sure I get it done in 2 minutes. No, so the title of my PhD thesis was Middle Power Security Cooperation. So I spent 5 years of my life literally on point number 3. But I'll do it in 2 minutes, Ian, I promise. I think the question is, Korea's response to Ukraine is a reflection of many of those past transitions that Korea went through. And for Korea, Russia is still a great power. In Australia, we don't think of Russia as a great power, right? You think back a few years to a certain former prime minister threatening to shirt front Vladimir Putin. There's a great deal of sense that, we live in, a broadly equal world. The Koreans don't see Russia that way. It sits very close to Korea. Much of its energy and infrastructure and transport is deeply tied to Korea. Korean aspirations for unification go through Vladivostok. There will be no unification without Russian support. So the Korean approach to Ukraine is tinted through that lens of how do you navigate that great power relationship in a way that is not a zero-sum, easy call, right? So I think that's been the struggle, and it's been a very long struggle between the Koreans and the US on how to get there. But I think point number 1 is the one that I always share when I go to Seoul. Clarity about why, what Korea wants to defend, who it wants to defend, will ultimately, I think, make the idea of middle power solidarity more attractive, I think, or perhaps I hope.
Brilliant. Thanks, Peter. I'd like to now invite... Thank you. I'd like to invite our friend here at Queensland Art Gallery, Gallery Modern Art, Tara Nagesh, to give the vote of thanks. Taryn.
Thank you, Ian. Thank you, Peter. My name is Tara Nagesh. I'm curatorial manager here of Asian and Pacific Art at the Queensland Art Gallery and Gallery Modern Art. On behalf of the gallery, thank you for coming, and it's my pleasure to offer a very brief vote of thanks. Given Ian and Peter worked so hard to keep on time, I'm not going to go on for too long. Firstly, of course, to our speaker, Dr. Peter Lee, thank you for travelling here. Thank you for sharing that presentation in such a succinct and clear way, and the thought and the time you've given to that, and for speaking to us tonight. And sharing that immense expertise on such a timely topic. I think we went from the fear of abandonment to how North Korea is the most normal country in East Asia. I was really hoping there was going to be something about Korea and Australia in a non-aligned movement, and we would have this great access to K-pop stars and all this kind of thing. But so it's sad that you knocked that on the head. But also thank you for keeping to the soundtrack from the opening to the chorus as well. But I think this relationship, thinking about middle powers and their relationships and thinking about Korea's history and Australia's position now, certainly something I hadn't thought of, and I found it deeply insightful. As I did you talking about the artwork out in the foyer and how they look like Chinese surveillance balloons. Thank you also, Peter. Thank you for being here in person tonight. Thank you for fielding all those questions. This question time, this dialogue is something we greatly value about Perspectives Asia, and thank you for very thoughtfully answering them. Quick thank you to Professor Ian Hall and Megan and Kelsey from the Griffith Asia Institute for making it possible and suggesting Peter to speak tonight. These are forums through our partnership we're so thrilled to be able to have multiple times throughout the year. going on a partnership for well over 15 years. And finally, thank you to you all for coming and participating in this forum tonight. We hope you can all join us for upcoming Perspectives Asia. We're planning one for May that I really wanted to announce tonight, but I was told we better wait until we make final confirmation. But it'll be an exciting speaker and a couple more later in the year. So please do look out for the emails or sign up if you're not on the mailing list through Griffith Asia Institute website. Thank you all again for joining us, and thank you, Peter. We hope to see you all soon again. Thanks.